and welcome back to the Good Girl Confessional. I'm your host, Sandy Lowries, and the Good Girl Confessional podcast is proudly brought to us by WB40, Women Beyond 40, a podcast for women 40, 50, 60 and beyond who want to feel seen and heard in the media. You can check us out at WB40.com. Before I begin today's podcast, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. It is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and those emerging, and pay homage to their ancient history of storytelling. Today in the podcast, I have a very, very special guest, someone I love and adore. My guest is writer Jo Pybus. She is also obviously the co-host of the other podcast that I am on, Alex the Seal, a podcast about the songs of the 70s and 80s that got us hooked up, knocked up and broken up. But Jo Pybus is also an incredible human being. She describes herself as a late onset feminist, late onset writer and athlete. She is the proud mother of 3 children, and she has recently written an article that has been published in a number of publications, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and it's gone gangbusters. This is an extraordinary article where Jo talks about growing up with an alcoholic mum and the effects that had on her as a child. Really, what she wants to explore is, what will your legacy be? Her article, called "I Didn't Want to Demonise My Alcoholic Mother in Her Eulogy, but I Wasn't Going to Lie Either," has been picked up and shared around Australia. It's really quite remarkable. This is an amazing podcast for anybody who perhaps has thought about grey area drinking, alcohol abuse, or maybe feeling they are pushing the boundaries a little bit too much. Yeah, it's wonderful. Please welcome to the podcast for the second time, the lovely Jo Pybus.
Hey, it's another Sandy here, Sandy Davies. I'm the founder and formulator of Happy Pause Balm for intimate dryness. Find us over at happypause.com.au. That's happypause.com.au, and get some happy on down there. And in the meantime, keep listening to Powerhouse Sandy Lowries on the Good Girl Confessional podcast, where every woman has a story.
Hello, beautiful Jo Pybus, and welcome again to my podcast, The Good Girl Confessional. How are you, gorgeous?
Oh, Sandy, I'm so excited to be here, being interviewed by you. This is such an unusual place for us to be because, of course, we're normally chatting together on our own podcast, but I feel very privileged to be back here on The Good Girl Confessional because this is my second time. Clearly, I have a lot to confess.
And, you know, we do love a good confession here at the confessional, but the thing about the confessional is confessions are always welcome, but they're never mandatory. And, you touched on that. We are, of course, co-hosts of the brilliant Alex the Seal, the podcast. And I'm shouting out here, if you haven't listened to it, please do. It was the brainchild of my gorgeous co-host, Jo. Alex the Seal is a play on words, a mondegreen, if you like, from the Go-Go's song, Our Lips Are Sealed. And we love it. We do talk about, what do we talk about, Jo?
Oh, we talk about all the music that we were exposed to growing up in the 70s and 80s. And it's all the music that got us hooked up, knocked up and broken up. And we make no apologies for that. We also sing along, which, as my kids like to refer to, it's as cringy AF. You'll work out what the AF means, and that's part of the charm. So, yeah, come and join us over there at Alex the Seal. Do yourself a favour.
And of course, I will put up links to Alex the Seal because, Jo, I actually met you originally through this podcast, through the Good Girl Confessional podcast. So maybe let's start with that, because then I want to jump into why I'm so excited to chat with you today. So how did we meet, Jo?
Oh, well, I guess we met because we're both midlife women, and you, of course, took that creatively to create this wonderful platform for women 40 and over at a time in our lives where so many things change, and not just physically but emotionally, and sandwich generation and all the other things that culminate when you start heading to that midlife. And for me at that time, of course, I had a platform of talking about perimenopause And largely the point being that I had no idea what the hell was happening to my body. And from that and through my writing, I became an advocate and appeared on SBS Insight. And then you invited me, of course, onto the Good Girl Confessional to discuss all those things that had been happening for me midlife, to share those stories with other women, because we certainly felt strongly that it was the silence of our forefathers and foremothers and, around the topic of menopause that was causing a lot of unnecessary angst. So, yeah, that's how we met.
We sure did. And I love everything about you, Jo. You know that because we've become firm friends.
We have.
We are podcast buddies, yes, but beyond that, we are friends also. And one of the things I love about you, Jo, is that you are an advocate for women heading into this midlife point. And I always do make a point that it's not just women in midlife who suffer with perimenopause, and there are much younger women, as we now know, who go through it as well. But that you were pushing boundaries. And as you say, you sort of hit this stage of your life and you became what I love that you call yourself. You're a late onset feminist, you're a late onset writer, you're a late onset athlete. And she's all of these amazing things, ladies and gentlemen. You really are. But you started writing and really advocating through your writing for women like me and like for all of us who are going through these things. And we have to scrounge around, really. Like, it's getting better, but still, I call it chicken scratching. We're like scrounging around on the interwebs, going, where's some information? What the hell is happening to me now? And God forbid you say the word menopause or perimenopause, see how loudly I say it, out into the universe, because it becomes like, it's so taboo, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. And look, it is changing. It is changing, that's for sure. And it's really lovely to see, even in the sort of, I guess, 5 years I've been in this space, the turnaround that's happening. And, it's getting into government and hopefully into legislation and all that stuff. Things are better, and largely because of people like you, Sandy, because you have a voice and an audience, and that's what you need to get the message out. So, well done you. You really are a champion. And you are one of those women who lift other women. And I love that too, because, sometimes women just sort of implode in midlife and they just lose that, ability to shine. And it's often just your bloody hormones that are doing it. But with that silence and lack of information, you just figure that you're the only one, or no one's talking about it, must just be me. And so that's awful. That's awful. So we need to...
Yeah, it is. It is. And it leads to, of course, this feeling for a lot of women, as we know, Jo, we've talked about this before, but a lot of women feeling invisible, which is why I started my platform and why, thankfully, women like yourself are writing about this stuff and really getting out into the universe, because it's so important. You're not alone, ladies. That's the big message to everyone. But the interesting part about growing up and heading into midlife, I always say that aging is a damn privilege and we're very, very lucky, but sometimes it doesn't feel like that when you're in the grip of crap and you've lost your confidence and you don't feel visible in the workplace or in your life even. We're part of this sandwich generation, Jo. We're part of taking care of elderly parents while we're raising teenagers largely. In my case now, my kids are grown up. I've lost both of my parents. But there's this kind of vortex that happens for a little while where your entire life is consumed with taking care of others.
Very true. Yeah. And generally it coincides with your body going through major changes, which, because of our lack of education of knowing exactly how that plays out, you are silent about it.
Yeah, very silent. Yeah, it's really true, because we can't be, as women, seen to be complaining. Hence, I call this podcast the Good Girl Confessional for a reason, right? We're supposed to be the good girl.
Yeah.
As if, like, just saying, hey, I'm having a shit day somehow makes you not good. It's so ridiculous, isn't it? But I really want to talk to you today, Jo, because part of being in midlife, obviously, is that we get to a point where we start to kind of have a better understanding of who we are, where we came from, what shaped us and what formed us in our lives. And you quite brilliantly have written quite a powerful article that has gone gangbusters, and I'm super proud of you for doing this. Courageous, amazing, because it's always really difficult to tell your truth. I think that's true of everyone. I've written about my life, and I know have done it. It's difficult. But you wrote this brilliant article that's called, "I didn't want to demonize my alcoholic mother in her eulogy, but I wasn't going to lie either." Powerful, like heading, even the headliner is quite powerful. But I wanted to talk to you today about your article, how it came to be, and maybe give our listeners a little bit of insight into where that came from and why it was so important for you now at this time in your life to share that story with us.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandy. And in fact, the title of it was chosen by the Sunday Life, who published it in their Insert magazine that goes into a number of Sunday papers around Australia. I originally titled the article myself, "Daughter of a Functioning Alcoholic," but the message is true from both sides. And it's been a very big week, Sandy. It's been a week since it's been published. It's been a huge week, so thank you.
Yeah, it's I can imagine. One of the things, since we're tapping in here, we're talking about midlife. One of the most amazing kind of things that are coming out recently is how the largest group of people in Australia, and probably globally, I don't know, but definitely in Australia, suffering with alcoholism is women in midlife. And your article is a powerful story, true story about growing up with an alcoholic mum. Tell us a little bit about the backstory first.
Yeah. Well, Sandy, I grew up in a house where alcohol brought tears and regret. I was one of 4 kids. My parents split up when I was about 6 years old, and within a couple of years, my mum met my stepdad and remarried. 2 of my siblings, my brothers, moved away to live with my father, and my sister, she was the eldest, was 8 years older. So by the time all this came around, she was about 16. She left home. So essentially my family unit growing up from a fairly young child was myself, my mother and my stepdad. And I guess for mum, it was a new relationship, a new beginning. And that came with parties, and she worked as a barmaid. There was a lot of late night stuff. And my stepfather worked on oil rigs. So not a normal working week. Oil rig workers will go away for 1 or 2 weeks and then come home for 1 or 2 weeks. And the weeks at home for many was just a time of nothing. So they had to find something to do. It was often on the oil rig crew change days, though, when a fella's been offshore for a week or 2 and hasn't had a drink. The first place they go to the pub, and often those days were not a Friday or a Saturday. So, the partying and the heavy alcohol drinking could happen on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. And that all came home to the house. And, I guess in our house, though, some people's house, alcohol brings joy and fun and laughter and a headache the following day. But in our house, it just never did. It always brought tears and regret. It fueled gambling, which brought more tears and regret. It fueled domestic violence. It fueled risky behaviours. And it ruined any chance a little girl had of enjoying her childhood in the same way as many other kids get to. And that, I guess, is all in that article. And, that's that story. Yeah.
Yeah, well. And, I read the article, and having known you, and I've known parts of your life, but to actually read something, I think, in black and white, it gives you a very different perspective, because you get to sit with it and absorb it a little bit more even. In the article, you talk about, being bundled up as a little girl, like bundled up into cars, being driven home by people who had no right to be drinking. Let's talk about that a little bit. So, in the 70s, let's face it, the whole booze bust thing was not really happening like it is now. In fact, people weren't even wearing seatbelts, let alone, you know what I mean? So drink driving was probably more... I don't know, prevalent probably would be the word. I'm not saying that police never pulled anyone.
No.
They did.
Yeah.
But your chances of being pulled over now if you were a drink driver is much higher than it was back then.
Yeah, that's right.
But you're a little girl trying to go to school, Jo.
Yeah.
And trying to just get on with your life. So tell me about, like, what was it like? You know, your parents are out drinking with friends or by themselves, and you're bundled up, and you just have to go along for the ride. And you get back to the house. There's a story where you talk about not being able to go to school the next day because mum had taken you somewhere.
Yeah.
Do you want to share? You feel okay to share that?
Yeah, of course, Andy. I think at this stage, you know, it took a little while for me to feel that I could share it, but now I feel I need to, and so. But thank you for asking that. Look, yeah, when I was very little, I guess my parents knew enough not to leave me home, which was good because there are kids that were left at home. So, you know, my story is that that story that just lingers under the radar of being a real big problem, and that's why it's important to say it, because we hear the extremes, and there's a whole generation of kids that just sat in this sort of cesspool of drinking and not really enjoying their childhood at the hands of their parents, but was never bad enough to really draw the ire of authorities or even for other family members to step in, interesting enough. But yeah, look, there was lots of times where, you know, I guess the thing for me was that makes it different to lots of kids was that with drinking always brought anger and tears and fights. So mum would be a very angry drunk, an ugly drunk, I like to call it. It's not a nice name. It was never about getting tipsy. It was about getting shit-faced. In fact, in the article, I actually used the word shit-faced, but they changed it to wasted. And I understood they obviously needed to tone it down, but it really was that juxtaposition of being tipsy versus shit-faced. And when you're like that, your senses, everything is driven by emotion and drama of having to express that ugliness. And that would come with the dramatic driving off in a car when you shouldn't be behind the wheel of a car. You know, that would come with me being asleep on a couch in a strange house and, you know, the next morning, well, how do I get to school and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, it tipped over into that ugly side. And, you know, I've talked about it with friends, strange people, strange places. I really could have been one of those kids that, you know, ended up in a situation. Luckily, I wasn't. Luckily, I wasn't around people who had an inclination to do that, because I was definitely exposed to someone who might want to take advantage of that situation. So, yeah, it was, I know now, I guess as a grown-up, at the time you normalise it a little bit as a kid, but how wrong that was. And, yeah, those heartbreaking times when I don't know how many times I missed Monday of school, because often when my stepdad would go off to work, Mum would want to go to Melbourne on the weekend, and she had a friend who'd been her bridesmaid actually at her first wedding, who was a single mum and had her own kids. We would go to her home and, you know, the mums would get drunk all weekend, and, you know, that was sort of all right. They enjoyed each other's company, and that's fine. But when my mum's friends' kids were getting up and going to school on Monday morning with the sandwiches she'd made them, because even though she played that game of, you know, getting drunk and reminiscing with her friends, she also looked after her kids. I was the one still in Melbourne because I lived, you know, 3 hours drive away in Sale. No school that day, you know. It was always me that got that end of the stick. And, yeah, that obviously that bit in the story where I tell you we'd been practicing for quite a long time, my class, to do a poem by Walter Delamere called The Storm. And I had been chosen to deliver the first line of that poem along with a fellow classmate. Which starts first, there were two of us and our two voices would come out and then the whole class would join in. It was a beautiful poem, and I was so proud that I was going to be going to the Eisteddfod with my class. And of course the Eisteddfod was on a Monday, wasn't it? And I missed out. And I remember crying my little heart out, you know, devastated. So yeah, that was really, really, you know, that's messed up. That's messed up.
Oh,
It is. And, Joe, and I've said this to you because I picked up the phone and I'm very grateful that Joe sent me the article right before it hit print, which was amazing. And I got to read it. And I picked up the phone. I had to call you because, genuinely and even now I'm getting really emotional. It actually brought me to tears because all I could picture was little Joe sitting there missing out on this amazing moment. And I know in my life that I had missed out on many little moments, but the way that you share this story is so heartbreaking. And I said to Joe, I wish I'd known you then because I think little Sandy and little Joe would have been besties and we would have hung out and we would have just, sat with each other in the schoolyard. And I would have been eating my Vegemite sandwich and then Jo would have been eating her salad roll from the milk bar. See, that to me was really fascinating too, Jo, because as much as I know things about you, one of the things that you talked about is exactly that. And it's the symbolism of this is so powerful that as kids we expect to go to school and have lunch. Now, my parents were not very wealthy people and I went to lunch and, lunch wasn't, I went to school with some kids who were European, right? They used to have these amazing, incredible chunky rolls with amazing meat and cheese.
Olives. They take olives to school.
Right. But they would have had salami and amazing cheeses and stuff. Here I was the kid with the white bread and the Vegemite sanger, I didn't even have Vegemite and cheese, just Vegemite sanger. And you might have had a piece of fruit. And actually my mum used to make, she would make all of her own biscuit slices, that sort of thing. We've talked about slices over on Alex.
We have, yeah.
So if you had people coming over, you might have got some leftovers, right? So you might have got something really exciting like the leftovers of a jelly slice.
Or could you maybe have got a little after dinner mint slipped into your...
Imagine, no, never. No, never got an after dinner mint in my lunchbox. Don't you worry about that, Jo. But you were talking about because as a kid whose mum is drinking all the time, there's a very real need to grow up very quickly and take care of yourself in a lot of ways and become fiercely independent. And I have written about it. My life experience and Jo's are, of course, quite different, but I did grow up in, an abusive sort of household in many different ways. And I do remember my mum sinking her sorrows into definitely the cooler bar cask wine.
Yeah,
was always prevalent in my house, and so my mum did like a bit of a tipple, and she lived with chronic pain, Jo. So she was also on a lot of painkillers and also smoking a lot of dope, right? Just trying to deal. So in some ways, you grow up very, very quickly.
Yeah.
In your household, same was happening. You're taking care of yourself. I imagine that you are dressing yourself. I imagine you're organising your own uniform or your own clothes for school.
Yeah.
And then you tell this story of turning up at school with this salad roll, which you buy at the local milk bar because your mum's not making you lunch.
Yeah, yeah. And, I know there's a school of thought, oh, well, God, at least you got to get some lunch. Some kids didn't even have lunch. And I totally get that. I'm not speaking on behalf of those kids, that socio-demographic that mum and dad couldn't even have any food. That's another whole level of sadness that I didn't have to deal with, and for that I'm grateful. But I was a little kid and all I wanted was a boring lunchbox with a Vegemite sandwich in it, and I wanted to look like the other kids, And, it was always, I'll just grab, $1 out of my purse, every morning. Mum was never up with me getting ready for school. I was up. I'd stand in front of, you'd have that 1 bar heater in the living room, and on a cold winter's morning, and you'd take your clothes out, and I'd dress in front of it. I'd get my own breakfast. So there's no question there was always food in the house. There was that, but there was no nurturing. And that when you make your kid a lunch, you're showing your love the best way you can. And there was no love coming in that way for me. And I could have. There was our school at the time. A lot of schools back then, especially primary schools, didn't have canteens. So we had a little milk bar across the road from school where kids could go over and get their lunch at lunchtime. But I didn't even want to do that. I went to the milk bar closer to my home. I wanted it to look like Mum had made me that salad roll. I wanted to sit there and complain to the kids. Oh, I wonder, I'll just pull this. I don't even know what I've got today. I would play this little game. And, fake news. Jo did know what she got. She bought it on the way to school. I could have had that pie and lollies every day. I could have been smashing down Jaquitos and, knocking back big M's every day. But I chose to make it look like that food came from my home. And I think, there's lots to this story that obviously in this 800-word article, you don't tell it all. But as an interesting addendum to that, when my stepfather, of course, who worked offshore on oil rigs, there was never a need as a man to get up, go to work and have lunch. You know what I mean? You're either out there getting fed or at home. And for a short period of time when he had no work offshore, he worked as a concreting labourer, having to get up at 6, be at work by 7, that sort of stuff. All of a sudden, Mum was up and out of bed, making him a fully cooked breakfast, packing his lunch, at a time when I, as a kid, wasn't getting my lunch made. So it's funny. I feel sorry for the little girl. I don't feel a great bitterness for Mum. I just feel a numbness. What the hell were you thinking, Mum? That was awful. And that sent a really awful message to me as a little girl. But that's because she was so, still in that honeymoon phase of this new relationship and wanting to, look after her man. She was so happy to be in that relationship. But as I said in the article, I was the third wheel. Here, stepdad, here's your beautiful lunchbox and your cooked breakfast. Here, little girl, here's your $1. Go and buy your lunch. And so, it's it's complicated, Sandy. It's complicated. Mum loved me. I know she did. She just had a really weird way of showing it, and it's hard to explain, and it's only people that are in that circumstance that can really feel that complexity that you and I have discussed, because I know your own story of trauma, and you can't just say, well, why don't you obviously just hate her, or why do you even just talk about it? Because it's complicated and because it needs to be talked about. That's why. So
yeah, I think look, and so beautifully said, Jo. That's the reality. I think these relationships with parents going through their own trauma, generational trauma, this is a big topic that a lot of people don't understand. And even for those of us who've lived through trauma, it's difficult for us to even comprehend and understand it. It takes a long time and a lot of years, I think, to unpack that. And for some people, they never unpack it.
No.
They never really come to terms with it. I had such a difficult relationship with my mum growing up for a number of reasons, and people who've read my stories or whatever, or who've heard this podcast will know. But it took a long time for me to really unpack so much of this stuff, to go through the journey of being a mother myself, perhaps, all of the things. To finally sort of say to my mum, or I didn't even say it to her, but for me to forgive her and genuinely forgive her, not just a surface forgive, because I think I tried over many years to forgive her many times. When I did finally forgive her, our relationship towards the end of her life was actually the best it had ever been. And I think for me, it was an acceptance of, this is who you are. And these are the things that you've gone through. And me understanding the trauma that she had lived through and all the ways that she tried to block that trauma because she didn't have the tools or skills or desire or whatever it may have been to be able to deal with it. My mum had a lot of mental health issues. She was a traumatized child. She'd gone through a rape. She'd been through a whole lot of things as a kid. It was pretty awful. And then she was in an abusive marriage. And then, she meets my stepfather, the most beautiful man in the world. Her whole life was about him and not necessarily about her children. And, it takes a lot to unpack that. For you, Jo, I imagine, again, just like that, as the child living in trauma, there's generational trauma. Your mum's drinking. We'll say she was an alcoholic, sadly, but your mum's drinking was clearly to cover up thoughts, emotions, feelings, trauma, whatever it may have been in her own life, because a lot of women of that generation perhaps didn't have those tools.
Yeah, I do wonder. I do wonder where Mum, how she became the mum she was. She came from a very loving lower middle class, working class family in Melbourne. She comes from a beautiful extended family. There were 13 cousins. They spent holidays together. And I certainly have asked, I have no reason to believe that there was anything in her childhood that she drew upon to become the woman she was. However, something obviously happened to her in puberty. And, nowadays that could have been borderline personality disorder. It could have been ADHD. It could have been a number of things, underlying mental health things, that meant that as soon as she hit puberty, she started doing really risky things. And one of them was having sex with my father as a 16-year-old. And by the time she was 20, because they were then forced to marry, she got pregnant. By the time she was 20, she had 3 kids, my 3 older siblings. By the time she was 24, she had 4 of us. She had me. That must have been traumatic. To be, we know humans, our frontal lobe hasn't fully developed until we're 25. And before she's even 20, she's a mum with 3 kids. Now, that relationship didn't work out. My own father, my actual biological father, he comes from trauma, absolutely. But he wasn't a horrible man. There wasn't, he was just numb to emotion. And so that relationship never worked out. That's fine. But her decision to then send my 2 brothers to live with my father was a real changing point in hindsight, because I know that her family, especially my grandfather, was brokenhearted that she split us kids up. I know they would have helped her emotionally and financially, but she shunned that because I think came from her a bitterness that my father wasn't going to get away with now having the life of a single man, and that he would have to take 2 out of the 4 kids. That is the point where I think the wheels fell off any chance she had of being a nurturing mum. And she did say to me just once in her latter years, always with a few drinks under her belly, that's where things came out, that she remembers that her own father never looked at her the same again when she sent those boys away. And that was a point of regret. And and then when I became a mother myself, you'd love your kids. Oh my God, you would, your arms go out in front of them all the time, be it in a car, be it crossing a road. Your instincts, your primal instincts to nurture and love your kids is just, I don't know how hers switched off. I don't know. I can't explain that. And I will never reconcile with that because I cannot relate to it. And I'm really grateful that I don't.
Yeah. Wow, Jo. As you know, my story in that way is similar. And there were 5 children. My mother had 5 children by the time she was 25. Yeah, really bad. And, when she left, the person that I believed was my biological father, who was not he was a pretty horrible person. And she left him, but she left all of us. And I guess she fled, I guess. And I felt very bad. And there's all those sort of issues that you deal with, and I have dealt with, thankfully, but it's a lot. And then when she came back, she sort of handpicked the kids, and the boys lived with our father, and eventually the 3 girls were with our mother, and that was traumatic for a number of reasons. Clearly, to be separated as children is really difficult, and when she left, you take on certain roles, right? So not only were we left with an abusive father, but we're also, we're all going through our own journeys. And I think that if you ask 5 children what their recollection of that time was, all 5 of us would have a completely different journey and a different story to tell, which makes sense because our truth is our own truth.
Yeah.
It's hard, Jo, and it's right. And I think that for me, much like you, it's so difficult to comprehend. I have 3 children. I've raised 3 children. The thought of actually dividing them would be just horrific. I can't imagine. It would just never be a thought.
No.
And for a long time I thought, it must have been financial. It must have been a lot of things because she was doing it really tough. But then later, I remember someone telling me that, my beautiful stepdad, when she met him, said, oh no, we can have all of the kids and take all of the kids. And her choice was no. For whatever reason. Now, that didn't come from her mouth. So, you go secrets and lies. Who knows what's factual and who isn't? And
yeah.
But the interesting thing about that, as you say, is this is how we get formed as human beings.
Yeah.
We are the sum of our past. But I want to talk about now. You have sadly lost your mum. That mum has flown wings and off she's gone, and that was 2014.
Yeah, it's a while ago now. Just had the anniversary the other day, 9 years. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And why you feel now like this strength to tell the story, which, by the way, I'm putting out there is a story that has to be told and should be told. And I'm incredibly grateful that you've told it, because in you telling this story, Jo, and I'm just going to put it out there, I do believe this story will resonate with so many people, and your experience so far, I hope, has been exactly that.
Yeah. Look, sorry, what was your question? About me writing it. Why? How did I feel that the writing it now?
I guess, how did you come to a point where you felt like now's the time? I feel okay and I'm ready to talk about it.
Yeah. Look, I wrote the article actually a couple of years ago, and look, I'm a writer. I've been writing now for a number of years. So I honestly wrote it and thought, yes, one day I can see a day when I might submit it for publishing. So yes, the writing of it, and there's that cathartic side of it too. It was good to get it out of my chest and onto paper. And I also wrote it because much of my nonfiction writing anyway is my life's observations and my personal experiences. So the writing of it wasn't a problem. I've had messages from people, why did you publish it, 2 years after you wrote it? And that's a bloody good question. Well, I'm a writer. I share my writing as the first answer. But it took me a little bit of time to get the messaging right. So I didn't, at first I often sit on my articles, but this one I sat on an awfully long time. And I would sort of revisit it every 6 months. But, as I've said, my relationship with my mum was complicated. And I didn't want it to be about mummy issues and punishing her. That was important to me. It had to be a message about legacy. And, how do you want to be remembered? Because it was that point of having to do a eulogy and thinking, well, what the hell have I got to say about this woman? Mum did nothing remarkable. She shunned being involved in any community things or even in school things. You know what I mean? She just lived in her world of drink and seeking out other people like her to do that with. And another big motivator for me, Sandy, was the data around drinking, which we know in COVID got worse. We know for women between 40 and 65 is getting worse, not better. And there's a new cohort of people drinking more regularly than they ever used to. So, whoa, what's happening here? And look, initially, as you know, Sandy, most of my work gets published with Her Canberra. I'm a freelance writer, and Her Canberra is an online media site that's very localised around the Canberra region. But I thought, you know what, if I'm going to share this, it has to go. I'm only going to give it up if it gets to go to the whole of Australia, because once I got my messaging right, I was really quite motivated for it to be out there for everyone to see. And so I gave it to Genevieve Quigley, who's a couple of months ago, thinking that this is going to be a good time as we approach Dry July, because this is the time we hear all those terrible statistics around drinking. And Genevieve's a lovely lady I met a couple of years ago. Anyway, 2 months later, I got the word and they said it's going to be published. And then, of course, bang, I sort of hit the deck then, because I thought, this is good. But, my spidey senses went up and I thought, wow, I felt so emotional in the days leading up to it. And I guess what I realise now, it was that childhood feeling of being called a drama queen, which, for anyone that reads the article will know what I mean, because that became a part of the narrative. When grown-ups don't want kids telling them the truth, they'll gaslight them and tell them that they're being overdramatic. And so this drama queen thing was, circling above me like a buzzard in the days leading up, thinking that's what people are going to think. And anyway, it hasn't been the case, fortunately. But I also knew that there were some people out there that have known me a long, long time, and they may have suspected some of this stuff, or they knew little bits, or they may have forgotten. But now we're going to have this 800-word summary shoved in their faces. And, I was a little bit nervous about that and curious as to their reactions as well, because I guess over my life, especially when I was young, none of the grown-ups from that time ever validated my feeling. It was a dirty little secret. You didn't talk about other families, and that was the era that it was then. And so that was all, bubbling away leading up to it being published. Quite overwhelming.
Yeah, wow. And I remember, like, I was checking in on you, how you're feeling. I think, and it makes sense that you would be worried about family members who perhaps didn't want to talk about this, had never talked about it, had never validated it, never sat you down over the years to say, hey, Jo, we knew what was happening and, are you okay or whatever.
No.
That didn't happen. And I think that's a common thing. It's really interesting that, a lot of people will know this, but because I didn't have a strong sense of family growing up, some of my girlfriends are genuinely family. And, we share Christmases together and Easter, and my gorgeous girls, Patsy and Rachel, are my sisters. And their beautiful dad, who is a social worker. So you couldn't find a more different family to mine, if you like, although their mum was really unwell, bless her. And she passed away when we were only 27. But her dad was this saint of a man. That's how everyone was allowed to come into their house morning, noon and night. He didn't care what time it was. He always would ask you, how are you? What's going on? Years later, he would say to me, he said, I was always amazed how, you basically came to be, because he said he knew. He said he actually told me that he knew what was going on in my house, that he knew the relationship with my mum. He knew issues that my mum was having. He probably knew issues my mum was having that I don't even know yet, and it's those sort of things. But this beautiful, sweet man who is still with us and he's still brilliant. I think for me, it was so common that people weren't talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't have school teachers saying to me, hey, how are you? Are you doing okay? I certainly didn't have, other people's parents. I didn't have an extended family at that point. So there was no one's going to step in anyway.
Yeah.
But there was sort of no one knocking on the door going, hey, I just want to check in on you. My mum's name was Dee, but there was no one knocking on the door going, Dee, we just want to check in on you. Are you doing okay? My dad also went off. He was in the Air Force and went off and lived, was working in Adelaide and we were in Melbourne. He would only come home on weekends, Jo.
Yeah.
So that interesting dynamic of being left alone, being a single woman, even though you're not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Drinking a lot, having your girlfriends over who are single parents. There's a lot of that going on. For you, what has the reaction been, Jo, from family, from strangers, from friends?
Yeah. Wow. It's come from so many quarters, Sandy, and I guess the overwhelming theme has been really positive and so validating. I feel I have a whole cloud of shame that has been lifted from me. I'm 56 and finally I feel that little girl's been heard. It's interesting. I everything goes back to that little girl. I want that little girl to be healed, and then that frees me up as an adult. I don't feel I as you know, Sandy, I have a beautiful husband, wonderful kids. I've had a very beautiful, privileged life that we worked hard for, and I didn't grow up an arsehole bringing up my kids and being an alcoholic. So it's my existence now, has really no bearing on that. But it's that little girl that never got to have that childhood. So the reactions, look, I've had dozens of people reaching out because it went nationally in the papers. It went nationally in the social media pages of those papers, and the amount of personal messages I've had from people that it's been so heartening. They've been telling me their stories, and the common message has been that they felt heard and thanking me for giving that story. So that's been very validating. I got a message from a girl I went to primary school with who remembers us doing the Eisteddfod and that poem. So that was really lovely. And just sort of saying, she would then said to her own child, you just never know what's going on in other people's houses. So very, very, very interesting and very true. The reaction of my own children. Now, this has been interesting, Sandy, because there's always trepidation from your immediate family when you put yourself out in the public domain in such a raw and vulnerable way. And look, you and I experienced that because we put ourselves out there. We're podcasters. You've got your magazine, your social media. And so there's always that cringy mummy moment of the kids not really sort of just turning away. Yep, you do you, mum, we're proud of you, but we're not going to engage with it. But so I was worried for the kids and what this might mean for them, and sensitive to that. But, I think that their response has been extraordinary because firstly, mum was then Nana and they remembered Nana, even as mum got older and mellowed. She's, you would never ring mum after 3:00 in the afternoon because she'd be slurring, she'd start drinking about 3. there weren't any great shocks in the story for them, but the fact that they read it from the beginning to the end is one thing, but also their messaging back to me is, Mum, you nailed it. You gave the right message. You know, this is a story that's going to make a difference. It's not going to polarize people into thinking you're a big whinger or go the other end of just, you know, that overt sympathy. You are sending a strong message here, and they really acknowledge that message. So I'm very grateful to them for that. And, you know, I'm very proud of them for recognizing that as well. And then there's my two high school friends, because you talk about the girls, Patsy and Rachel, and of course I've got Julie and Meredith, and you know, their support and their surprise at the depth of the problems, because I guess as a kid you hide that stuff. Now they were in and around my home and my mum, and they were the ones who I knew I could cherry pick the times that you could come to the house, knowing when it was good and when it wasn't. And so that's been lovely, you know, a lovely supporting thing. But I think the probably the most healing message I got was from a friend of the family's, a peer of my mum's, a woman who, you know, was around at those party times when I was growing up, who wasn't like Mum though. Her kids were loved and nurtured and got Vegemite sandwiches. and she just sent me a message to say, you know, you hit the nail on the head, Jo, and that Mum calling me a drama queen was just her statement to make her feel better, and, you know, saying that she was proud of me for who I'd become. And that was very special. That was very healing, because, of course, that wasn't happening when you're younger. You're not hearing those messages. Family, friends show their dismay by just withdrawing their friendship a little bit, or not necessarily reconnecting quickly after some of these explosive episodes where Mum was probably abusive to them. You know what I mean? She would, you know, and we'd all have to forgive and forget because, oh, well, I was drunk at the time, but then didn't stop her doing it again. So, you know, that was a really lovely thing too. It would have been nice to hear it 40 years ago, but hey, I'll take it. And then, of course, there's my husband, Paul, who I really got to acknowledge. None of this was a surprise to him. He always supports me. He's always my rock. I lean into him, and he left me with no doubt that this was a really important message. And, you know, I'm so grateful to have him. You know, we've been married nearly 33 years. He's a good egg. And how even that is a contrast to the woman, how I'm different from Mum, I suppose, you know, that our relationship is good.
Man, 100%, Jo. And I think here's the thing, and I find this with a lot of women, and I'm even watching you now do it, and because I love you so much, but I've got to I'm pointing it out, is that as women, you know, it's almost like, you know, you feel the need to say, my life was privileged, whatever, but we worked really hard for it. The reality is, Jo, that you've come from a really traumatic childhood background and made something brilliant of your life, and that you have supported, nurtured, you know, 3 incredible children, that you've had this really beautiful marriage, which it is, and that you've worked really hard to provide a life for those kids that is radically different from your mum. Now, whether that was by design, whether it's conscious or unconscious, the reality is that you've done that, and it's okay to pat yourself on the back for that and say, shit, look at me. I came out the other side. I always say, like, I walked through the ashes, you know, I rose like a phoenix, bro, and so have you. And I think that any child who's lived through trauma, who's gone on to have semblance of a you know, inverted commas, normal life, or created a life that is better than the one that they came from, is doing really an incredible thing. But what you also have done is you've broken generational trauma, Jo, and that is no small thing.
Look, yeah, you're right, Sandy. I feel like this is the time now, having had this article go out, having had my story being condensed down and shoved in the faces of those who were a part of that life. I feel that I'm hoping next time we talk that I can applaud myself. You know, when I think it's that little tiny voice that says, "Oh, come on, Jo, you know, you're being a bit dramatic," and that comes from my mum. That comes from that childhood, and that was her way of protecting her own bad behaviours. But Yeah, you're right. And I thank you for saying that. It is a very, very hard thing to do.
And I think hard for a lot of us, especially for women, especially to kind of go, right, look what I've done. I've achieved this great thing. You have achieved greatness, Jo, in your life. And you know, success, you want to measure success. Success is breaking that generational chain of events, if you like, that you are not reliant on alcohol or other drugs or other things to get you through your life.
Yeah.
And that your children have witnessed a very different kind of parenting than you witnessed yourself. And I think that, you know, that in and of itself is a huge, huge feature. Huge.
Thank you. Hey there. When Sandy's not interviewing kick-ass women, she's hanging out with me at Alex the Seal, a podcast about music and nostalgia. I'm Jo Pybus, and each episode, Sandy and I talk about all the songs that got us hooked up, knocked up, and broken up. Do yourself a favour and search Alex the Seal on your podcast app. Love you, Molly.
So, Jo, I really wanted to touch on something which I think is really important and that, you know, you've discussed with me, and I know it's very important to you. So let's talk about the lead up. You mentioned it before, but let's talk about it some more. The lead up to writing this eulogy for your mum and how difficult that was and why that is such a pivotal moment for you.
Yeah. Well, look, the article starts and ends with Mum's eulogy, and that became, I guess, the trigger to write it, because it raises the point of legacy. It raises the point of what you want to be remembered for when you die. And, you know, it's interesting because it's not a topic people want to contemplate. But how many times do we hear that people are full of regret at the end of their life and try to make amends, you know, all at that 11th hour? And I guess I'm trying to turn that notion on its arse and say, you know, why wait? Why wait? You know, you need to resolve these things when you're living. And I guess it also comes from the fact over the last 10 years, I've read a couple of books on Stoicism, which is an ancient school of philosophy that, you know, predates Christianity. Now, just, you know, as a point of reference here, I'm an atheist, so I have no belief in God nor religion. But the Stoics, like, you know, people will have heard of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Cato, Epictetus. They were these really cool dudes that thought hard about how to be a good human. And their wisdom still holds up today. And for me, I try and keep three of them swimming in my head. Number one is live a virtuous life. And in today's terms, that basically means be morally intact. Don't be an arsehole. So number one. Number two, I love this, be present in what you do. I mean, how the hell did these guys know we were going to be distracted by our phones 3,000 years later? I don't know. But anyway, it's a beautiful just thing to say to yourself every day. Be present in what you do. I certainly find myself dwelling a lot on the past and projecting a lot into the future, and just being in the now is so important. And the third one is want what you have. Again, how did these old guys know about FOMO, that fear of missing out? And that's really prevalent in today's society because we're always trying to accumulate more things, or we're seeing so much out there on social media that we want to be like or we want to have. Want what you already have. That's really important, and that goes back to the core of family. You know, just be within your own family unit and want what you've got there. But what the Stoics also do very well is they contemplate death. They contemplate their own death, and they contemplate the death of those that they love, even children. And now this is not so they can, you know, live with sorrow and fear and all that stuff, but so they can value each and every one, every living day, and never regret an opportunity to spend that day being with a loved one, thinking of a loved one, be it, you know, in thought, in deed, which I guess circles back to living a virtuous life, you know. Don't be an arsehole. So all that, I guess, became this melting pot of seeding the article. And as sad as funerals are, Sandy, and, you know, we all know they're horrible. They're, you know, so sad. Eulogies are such a wonderful way to celebrate a person's life. And the things that you learn about someone when you go to a funeral, those quiet little achievements, those acts of kindness, those stories of strength and character are so uplifting and leave you with a beautiful, endearing memory of the deceased. And it's really hard to deliver a eulogy when there's not a lot of virtue to draw from. And that is, I guess, the resounding theme of the article at the end of the day. My husband and I, we had a business for many years, and, over the years in businesses, you have people come in to run sessions of, how to be a better team and how to, your workplace is good and how to contribute and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things I remember very early in our business life was asking all the staff to write your own eulogy. And it seemed like a shocking thing to say at the time, but it came down to values and are you being your best self if you were to something were to happen to you right now? Very confronting, I know, but so important.
Yeah, and also, as you so rightly say, and which was the most powerful thing about your article, is how do you want to be remembered? Because at the end of the day, as you so rightly say in this article, that you didn't want to demonize your mum, but you also were not prepared to lie. And but really what you're asking people to do, and it's so thought-provoking, is to say, what's your legacy going to be? How do you want to be remembered? And and as you know, Jo, I've had a lot of guests on this show who've talked about grey area drinking, who have talked about their own lived experience and struggles with alcoholism, and who, have tried to find a different path for themselves. What I've not had is someone like yourself come on and say, I was the child, this happened to me, this was my parents' legacy, and this is how it's formed me as a human being. So that's really your message, isn't it? Is how do you want to be remembered by your children, by your family, by your colleagues, by your friends?
And I think that's the reason why Genevieve quickly at Sunday Life said, yep, I'll take this one, because I had pitched other articles that hadn't made it to publish. But yeah, it is that different perspective, dare I say a very sobering perspective, but it also speaks to the communities of these families, the village raising the child. I completely understand why back there in the 70s and 80s, other grown-ups didn't say too much. It was the way it was then. It's not bloody well not the way it is now. It's not. We look at what's been happening just in our country alone. We've all heard that saying that evil thrives when good people say nothing. And there's no doubt that my personal sense of social justice has been heightened with each Royal Commission this country has had into some of our, most despicable atrocities, things, we can barely listen to, but we have to listen to them. We have to be confronted with them. And look, I'm in no way likening my story to theirs. The Royal Commission into the institutionalised child abuse is just harrowing. And it's something that I go back and revisit and read and look at some of those transcripts to remind myself that this should never have happened. Some of that stuff happened in my own hometown of Sale, where kids that I would have known would have been victims. And, I've had conversations with my peers I grew up with. Why the hell didn't we know this? No one knew anything. Everyone was quiet back then. It's not where it has to be today. And look, as far as I'm concerned in today's world, I feel that silence makes you an accomplice, and that's going to sound really harsh, but remember, I'm the kid of the alcoholic, and I have grown up with this bitterness, but I'm not talking here about going in and ripping that child from the arms of their mother, but it's even the simple things like not validating that kid's experience or that person's experience, or not listening when they want to tell you their story because they sound a little unhinged, that's a part of where you become an accomplice. And, that you need to realise that these stories are real. If people sound a little bit cray-cray or a little bit unhinged, it's because they have been affected so deeply about their past, and that's the way people who are damaged come across. So, yeah, I guess if I had received a kind word from a grown-up when I was little, that what my mum was doing wasn't fair, I would have felt heard. And even within my own family, my uncle, who's a lovely man, always avoided conversations even as I grew up, and even after Mum died, I tried to start with him. And he'd deflect, oh, yes, your mum was a colourful character, and express some really misguided loyalty for her. And it's like, well, where's the loyalty to that little girl? And if that had just been something, even after all those years, that he would entertain and hear my story, I would have also felt heard. But, I'm also not an arsehole. I'm trying to be that virtuous person. So, I guess I don't challenge that either. But it does stick with me. And we need to be the generation that, does hear those ugly truths.
Yeah, absolutely, Jo. And I think, that, I am a person who, has my own gin bar, for Christ's sake. And I don't mean like an external gym bar. I'm in a gym bar in my house. I'm not that fancy, people. And I do love a tipple. And, I've been known to be that party girl and drink a lot. But I think at the same time too, I recognise my limitations in that, and that, I raised 3 amazing children, and that, thank God. So they did get lunch boxes, and they had a little bit more than a Vegemite sandwich. But we joke about that, but that's just a symbolism. If you think, about that. I don't mean to in any way make small that huge thing of care.
And Sarah,
you're right, Jo.
You would never have chosen your desire to want to drink in excess over something that your kids needed, like getting to school, No,
never. No, that's true, Jo. That's true. And look, so the thing about what you just said is so powerful and so important. I was so lucky to have adults in my life like that as I started to grow up. So, Patsy and Rachel's dad, the beautiful Tony Bucci, who my children call Pa and I call Pa, who was there and did occasionally just say that thing. Patsy and Rachel's mum, even when she was with us, saying to me, that she saw me and, are you okay? And I felt heard and I felt seen. And I think that just to have that, but also too that I know for a fact that there were adults who actually approached my mum and said, are you okay? How are you doing?
Yeah.
That's powerful too. And I found those things out much later in my life. And she would say to me, oh, people came, and I was going through the worst time of my life. And these random people came and asked, are you all right? I think it's okay. And what Jo is trying to say, and what we're both trying to say here, and it's such a powerful message, Jo, is that if a child comes to you and says, hey, life is a little bit crap right now, just hear them out. We're not talking about, you don't have to call social services, unless, of course, that's really bad. And then, of course, whatever. But we're just saying that if a kid comes to you and says, oh, things are a little bit tough at home, just listen, hear them out, validate them, and let them know that there's a space they can come if they need to talk. And that is so powerful. Those are the little moments in my life that got me through, Jo. And those are the moments, as you so rightly say, would have made such a difference to your life growing up.
Yeah. And look, I did have the safe harbour of my friends' houses. I'm not saying I didn't. I could have gone there any time. But A, as a child, you try not to give away too much. And B, it was an era where, the questions weren't asked. We just weren't as bolshy back then. It was sort of taboo, and I get that. I totally get that. But, the interesting thing too, Sandy, is that, backing up, perceived trauma, there's studies now, and there's specific studies around the daughters of alcoholics, which I found fascinating. Apparently, they show that daughters tend to experience more negative consequences when raised by an alcoholic. And that's not to say the trauma just washes over the boys. It certainly doesn't. But the lingering effects seem to be heightened in girls. So apparently both sons and daughters have a higher risk of becoming alcoholics themselves, but females tend to also have a higher risk of developing mental health disorders. So, it can just take on a whole other level of trauma. And the reality is that children of alcoholics tend to feel as though they never had a childhood of their own, that they had to raise their own parents, nurse their own wounds. And, absolutely 100% resonates with me, because you never have the freedom to be carefree, to feel safe, to know mum and dad are going to, be your safety net and fix everything. Stuff many kids take for granted, and so they bloody should, because that's what parents are supposed to do. So for me, that was very validating to read that and feel that, yep, I actually do have a right to feel the way I do.
Yeah, Jo, you really do. You really do. And I just personally want to say thank you for writing this article. It is powerful. It is thought-provoking for any parent out there, male, female. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what your gender is. For anybody out there who is listening to this who's a parent, it is a thought-provoking article, and we will put the links to this article, obviously, when we release this podcast, because I think it's such a powerful read. There is a trigger warning, I will say, in this, because we are talking about alcoholism and the impacts that this has on children. But it's a powerful read. And I would say that for a lot of us through COVID, Jo, myself included, drinking just became a thing because really we had more time in our hands. We couldn't go out.
Guilty as charged. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all doing it. I was putting up photos of cocktails I was making and whatever.
And bread. How was your sourdough?
Bread. Oh my God, I actually made sourdough. Everyone sourdough, and I actually made dumplings. I made all sorts of things, Jo, I'd never done before. We had online gnocchi cooking moments with my ex-husband's family. It was a lot of fun, actually. So there you go, my daughter and I. So much fun. Shout out to all of you lovely ladies. But yes, I think this article then is very sobering, as you say, because COVID, as we know, caused a massive spike in the amount of alcohol that people were drinking, especially women in our middle-age years. But for a lot of women, it's continued on. But the other thing I think that's really powerful to note is that women in our age bracket are the most likely to binge drink.
Yeah.
So you may not be drinking during the week. You may not be drinking a lot of the time. You may not even drink every weekend. When you do go out, you're hammering it. And I will say that I've been to a lot of events where I've been guilty of that. And I know friends have been guilty of that. We've had a lovely old time. But the reality is your article isn't about shaming everyone. Your article is about saying, hey, take notice of these things in your life. Pay attention to these things in your life. And are your drinking habits, whether it's grey area drinking, whether it's alcohol, whether you feel like you're teetering on the edge of alcohol abuse or you really do have an issue with alcohol, it is really going to take notice. And are your actions then impacting the lives of other people? And is that the legacy you want to have? And really, this was what your article was about, Jo.
Very true, Sandy. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Everything in moderation. But, yeah, I guess notice what's happening around you and how people are reacting to you. And don't brush it off because you feel wonderful when you're half-tanked. Or because, I think often we do feel wonderful when we're half-tanked, but when we're fully tanked, that's when the wheels can fall off. And, how do you draw the line for yourself? Also, how do you, it is a cycle. It's an addiction. It's a well-known addiction. And some people are more predisposed to it than others. I'm so lucky. Both my parents, biological parents, are alcoholics and it manifested in different ways. But how I miss that gene to not want to stop, I don't know. I just pinch myself every day and I'm thankful for it. But, the impacts on your physical being with, increasing your risk of disease, but also your social impacts of how you relate to your friends. Are people shunning you, family? Are you able to hold down your job? All those things. You need to reflect upon those. If you like to drink, enjoy it in moderation. And if it brings you to tears, then you might want to rethink what's going on.
Absolutely, Jo. And we will add here, I'm so grateful for Jo to come on here and share your incredible hard-won wisdom. That's what I like to call it, and it is, here in the confessional, because it's also July as we sit here today. It's the beginning of July. Dry July is about to start. For those that don't know, I will put up the links to Dry July as well. Now, whether or not you want to hit up Dry July and actually raise money for important research, do so. But if you really just want to use Dry July if you need an excuse, use Dry July as an excuse to maybe just say, well, maybe I'm not going to drink for a whole month and then see how it goes. I think that if you, I had Sarah Rusbatch on this podcast who talks about grey area drinking a lot. One thing that she always said is if you try to give up drinking and you're struggling, if all you're thinking about is alcohol, maybe you need to explore further that there's some other issues going on there for you. Maybe not. It's up to you. But I'm going to put up a whole lot of links with this podcast to Dry July, to a number of areas that maybe people can get some resources around grey area drinking and alcohol abuse. And I'm just so grateful to you, Jo, for bringing this article out into the world. I always say monsters cannot live where the light shines, and the reality is that you just shone a huge light on a very big monster that's just that is in our culture, which is alcohol.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy, and that's what I wanted to do. So thank you for endorsing that.
Yeah, you really have. I adore you, Jo Pybus. You're amazing. As I said, I will put the links to the article with this podcast and across socials. Please do yourself a favour, as Jo and I like to say over at Alexis Hill, do yourself a favour and read this article. It's a powerful read, and if it resonates with you for whatever reason, this is a good time to bring these conversations up with family and friends, and really to explore things about yourself as well. So thank you so much, Jo.
Thank you, Sandy. Thanks for having me on.
I love you.
Love you too.
Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is brought to you by WB40, Women Beyond 40 magazine. Available now at WB40.com. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to quality podcasts. We're also now available on YouTube. We chat with really interesting women about their hard-won wisdom, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for your support. Bye for now.